Uh-oh. We got something that doesn't look so good. You see that bee? That, my friend, is deformed wing virus.
Over the last few weeks, I've noticed a surplus of Facebook posts that go something along the lines of, my bees left this past weekend, had 3 boxes on, had plenty of resources and honey. I used mite strips earlier in the season. Why'd they leave? I've been seeing so many posts about people saying that their hives just up and left over the last couple weeks, and it is November, so this is usually the time of year when this does start to happen.
Well, the colony definitely got cut down. Whoa.
But this is a big head scratcher to beekeepers that have been trying to figure it out over the last decade. We have coined a blanket term for it called colony collapse disorder, or CDC. And what this pretty much is when you go into your hive, generally around this time of year, you'll notice that there's a sudden unexplained loss of the majority or all of the worker bees in your hive. In some cases, they will leave behind a queen, immature bees, and a small number of nurse bees. But in other cases, all they'll leave behind is an empty box and maybe a little bit of extra honey and pollen that they weren't able to carry with them. And one of the other things that I noticed as I was scrolling through all the comments on these posts is that 90% of the explanations for why this may have happened was all sourced back to Varroa mites. So I have a couple theories and some research also that I kind of want to just present to you and see what you guys think about it. So try to make it to the end because there is going to be a lot of information packed into this video. So what happens to a hive that collapses from mites? Usually in the first month or two, you will have a strong and vibrant colony, and they will be literally racking in the honey, and they will be going to flower to collect all that they can. And this is where the infestation of mites typically begins. It's when the bees go to these pollination sites where they're getting their resources to these flowers, that is when mites can jump from bee to bee. Now I will say, from what I've been reading, there is not an exact known of where exactly Varroa mites are coming from. We just know they all of a sudden appear in our hives and they're able to spread from hive to hive to hive. So not only is it coming from the pollination sites from where other bees are also visiting, but if there's any surrounding hives in your area, or if you even have other hives in your yard, they're just going to keep passing Varroa mites back and forth. Well, in month 3 to 4, the mite population begins to increase, and the mites utilize brood cells to reproduce, and they can typically make around 1 to 2 daughters per 1 worker cell, and in drone cells they can make 2 to 4 mite daughters. That is why they prefer drone cells over worker cells. Drone cells have a longer time that they're going to be developing as a larva into a honeybee, and it takes a little bit longer before they start uncapping and moving out of that cell. Those extra couple days gives those mites some extra time to keep on breeding. So at this point, the mites are still reproducing, and the curve, if you were to look at it on a graph, will start to go up as you see the mite levels start to grow throughout your colony.
That is a lot of mites. Oh.
By month 5 and 6, each cycle of the brood replicates more and more, and the development of new bees begin to be infected. Newly hatched mites feed off of the developing honeybee larva, weakening the newly formed baby bees and depriving them of nutrients and weakening their immune system. At this stage, you'll begin to notice that the hive population will begin to go down, and foragers will become less effective as they don't have the necessary nutrients to support their flights, and the viruses will begin to overtake their health. By month 7 and 8, because the foragers weren't able to be as productive in the previous months, the hive's food stores will begin to drop. The nurse bees begin consuming eggs to help conserve food, and this is when you'll start to see a spotty brood pattern, and you'll also start noticing some sick-looking brood. Some that may appear melted and laying flat on the side of the cell, and you will also notice uncapped brood cells where you can see the white heads of developing bees, and some of them will even look like they have their heads chewed off, and that is exactly what is happening there. Bees can actually chew off the particles of a baby bee that have a virus and are infected, and they can make their own form of like a vaccine to help feed back to the brood to help overcome it. Really cool they can do this, but when it comes to this situation, nothing they're really doing is helping. So by month 8 and 9, if the mite infestation remains unchecked, oftentimes you'll start to see the colony really start to collapse, and they'll be so far gone that you won't really be able to recover them. The few remaining bees that are left in the hive after this stage will abandon the hive in search of a healthier living condition, and they sometimes will leave behind a queen and a small number of immature bees, but oftentimes they will join surrounding hives if you have any in that yard or any that are in different locations, and they'll just leave that queen behind and try to save their self. So as you can see in this graph, as winter approaches, Varroa levels become unbearable as almost every bee in the colony now has a mite on it. This is what makes them so detrimental to a colony, is just because in the late summer and fall months, that is when your hive starts creating winter bees, and the population of your colony, you generally want to start going down once you get past September, because that's how they're going to be able to conserve more food stores, is when they go through winter with a smaller brood nest, but a healthy brood nest. That is the key. But when this happens, when they start reducing their numbers, these mite levels have been climbing this entire time. So they come to a point at some point where the mites are tipping over, and there's gonna be more mites in that colony than the bees can handle. There might be a mite on every single bee, and eventually it's gonna collapse that entire hive. So this last year of beekeeping was definitely one of the most eye-opening years I have had yet. This was my 5th year of beekeeping, and each year seems to have its own theme, and this year I would say the theme was starvation and timing, but also starvation.
So pretty much this entire bottom box is completely empty. All of these are drawn comb with absolutely nothing in it whatsoever.
And the reason I say that is this was one of those years that a lot of the trees just completely skipped over their flow. They didn't even bloom, and part of that is because of the weather. If it rains too much, it can cause the trees not to bloom. If it doesn't rain enough, it can cause the trees not to bloom. There's so many moving parts when it comes to how the environment works and how it keeps everything still going and as prosperous as possible. So mix this in, and also tie in that I was trying a brand new yard that hadn't really been vetted. And I say that because there are some locations that will just be really good honey locations. You'll move bees in, and all of a sudden you'll have this insane amount of nectar coming in that you can't even believe. And then there will be a yard where you put bees there, and you can tell there must not have ever really been a high number of bees in that area, because if you put bees someplace, generally over the years, they will start to curate more flowering plants. The plants will know that they can be pollinated, so they'll start putting out more flowers for the bees to pollinate. So that too, and maybe there's just not a diverse amount of flowers in that area, because there was a lot of goldenrod there, but that really seemed to be it. Those hives were starving all year. So that mixed in with, I was doing some splits to help increase our hive numbers. I had made some splits to go into that yard with the plan that the black locust flow is going to be able to build them up. Well, that's the part about beekeeping, is nothing ever goes according to plan. And it is very humbling. Beekeeping always has a way of teaching you something new every year, no matter how long you've been beekeeping. Really though. I've even heard people who've been beekeeping for like 30 or 40 years and they're still learning new stuff. That's what's cool. But what I ended up learning is what a hive looks like from start to finish that is starving, and how they can overcome it, what you can do to help pull them out of that. So what I saw was that those hives, they started growing, but then at some point they just completely cut off and they stopped. They weren't building any more comb. They weren't really bringing in a whole lot of resources, and any resources they were bringing in, they were consuming immediately. They only had enough to support them and not really any of the brood that they were starting to produce. But okay, I'll talk more about that in a second. So also last year, I posted a YouTube video that went over some of the research articles I was reading at the time around honeybees and varroa mites. And around this time, a researcher by the name of Dr. Samuel Ramsey had came out with a new discovery that what we knew about varroa mites and honeybees was actually wrong. And what he found out was that Varroa mites weren't actually feeding on what we believed was the hemolymph in a bee, which is the blood of a bee. They were actually feeding on something called Vitellogenin, which lives in the fat body of a bee. And you've probably heard, if you've been following me for the last couple years, then you've heard me talk about the importance of Vitellogenin, but I'll go over it again because it is something that every beekeeper, in my opinion, needs to know about because of how essential it is for the health of your bees. So Vitellogenin is pretty much their whole entire life force. It is what is responsible for all of their immune function, keeping their immune system strong. It is what differentiates them from a nurse bee to a forager. It's also what is part of the signaling that makes a nurse bee turn into a forager of when that should actually happen. It also is what is responsible for keeping them alive throughout the whole entire winter. That is why winter bees can survive for up to 6 months. Winter bees have more Vitellogenin than a summer bee does. And Vitellogenin is also very important for brood development as well. So this really got my wheels turning because from the sounds of it, if the Varroa mites are feeding off of Vitellogenin, then they're doing something far worse than just sucking out the hemolymph, the blood, in the body of a bee. They are collapsing a bee from the inside out. So what promotes higher levels of Vitellogenin? That was my first thought, because if we can raise the levels of Vitellogenin, then maybe this can help a little bit in the fight against Varroa mites. Well, I came across an article by Randy Oliver on the science of beekeeping, and it went, oh my gosh, his articles go so in depth. I appreciate reading them so much. Because with me and my science brain, it just all helps things click right into place. And what I learned is that pollen is our answer when it comes to Vitellogenin. So what I learned in this article is that every single time pollen drops, Vitellogenin also follows suit. And the lower the bee's Vitellogenin titer drops, the longer it takes for the colony to recover. But the reason I mentioned pollen is because our local climate has been changing a lot over the last couple years. I know in my area, it seems to be that you can't really ever count on goldenrod anymore, whereas whenever I've spoken to beekeepers that have been beekeeping since before the early 2000s, they've said that goldenrod used to hit so hard. It was one of the flows that they would really capitalize on. But now today, really all goldenrod is something small that the bees can get some pollen to help kind of brood them up for the winter time, but not many people are making big honey crops off of the goldenrod flow anymore. And also on top of that, something too worth mentioning is, so for a hobbyist, you may not ever need to feed your bees because you only have a couple colonies, but once you start getting up to maybe like 24 colonies in a yard, even honestly 10 colonies in a yard, those hives are going to start competing with each other. Even if you have maybe like a week or two where it's a really strong flow and they just start racking in all of that nectar and turning it into honey, one of the problems you're still going to run into is that the bees, they go through 3 to 4 pounds of pollen a week once they're in peak numbers because they're preparing for all those flows. So they really need to be bringing in pollen almost every single day just to keep those numbers up of in-hive pollen that they have to be able to feed off of and to keep everything running smoothly. Because when the foragers go out for pollen, what ends up happening is they bring it back to the hive, then they feed it to the nurse bees, which then take it to go into the hive and utilize it. They use the pollen to then feed to all of the brood as brood food and get that next generation going so the hive keeps thriving. And once they do all of that, then they go back to the foragers and they give them the reward for the day of like, hey, here's your food, good work, you did a good job. But what ends up happening is when those pollen levels start to drop, the bees, this is what signals them to stop making brood and to stop feeding the foragers as much too, which then ends up leading to foragers that aren't as strong and they become weak. So remember I said Vitellogenin drops immediately when pollen drops. So now we're seeing that the brood and the foragers have Vitellogenin levels that are dropping. And remember, these foragers are going out and they're picking up mites and bringing them back to the colony. So now we also have mites that are feeding on these Vitellogenin numbers in the bee's body and decreasing that slowly over time. So from what I saw in my starving colonies this year is that once the food stores drop, the colony really starts to kind of dwindle after that. I saw that it was like the colony just halted and could not really grow anymore. And when that kept continuing, eventually I started to see that I was getting a spotty brood pattern. And at first I was like, hey, maybe it's because of a poor queen. But if you dig deeper into that, I think we confuse a starving colony with having a poor queen very often, especially in the beginning when we're still learning everything we can about bees and how they work. But there's so many other factors that are going into how your hive is looking. It's not just the queen. You can have a great queen, but if they're starving, they're going to have a spotty brood pattern. And that is what I was seeing. They were starting to cannibalize eggs because that's what they do when they don't have enough food to feed them. Why would they let them hatch if they can't even, like I said, if they can't support them? So they start getting rid of them to try to help conserve energy in food stores. And once that started happening, I also started to notice that some of the brood was appearing sick. And I was starting to see what looked like European foul brood. So one of the characteristics of European foul brood is the bees will just begin to the larvae will begin to deflate and sink to the bottom of the cell and turn into a scale. That is what I was seeing. So I started trying to talk to as many people as I could, mostly beekeepers that maybe had 100 hives or thousands of hives, to try to find out what everybody knew about EFB or European foul brood. And the main thing that the group really emphasized on is that EFB is something that always is in the hive. It is a spore-forming bacteria that, just like how we are constantly coming in contact with bacteria and viruses and all sorts of pathogens. But what is important is that our bodies are strong enough to be able to fight it off. If we were to become sick, we can become vulnerable to all of these other pathogens. And the same thing happens with the bees. So they can still have EFB in their hive. They can fight it off. But the moment that they start getting stressed because they don't have enough food, they have high levels of Varroa mites, their Vitellogenin is dropping, which is responsible for their immune function, all of a sudden they can't fight these pathogens and they start getting sick. Now, I'm telling you this in reference to why your bees may have absconded this year, because in my brain, this all kind of looks connected. So let's look at the big picture of what was going on with your hive throughout the year. You see, okay, my hive was looking really strong, say in September, there was a lot of bees, but now I'm coming back to my hive and all of a sudden they are pretty much collapsed and there's nothing there left. Well, my first question would be, let's look at how they were doing in August before goldenrod hit. And I also say this because that was something that I noticed in my colonies. So I was about to start combining all of the colonies in this yard I was telling you about. This is the hunting yard that you guys have heard me talk about many times before, because at the rate that they were kind of shrinking, I knew that nothing was really going to come of them, especially if we were preparing for winter. Now, this was the beginning of August when I started noticing this. So I went to the yard and I was going to start combining everything. But what I noticed, because I was checking it maybe once a week at this point, because this was a problem yard and it really needed some extra care. But what I noticed was that all of a sudden these bees were starting to make more brood. So I was like, huh. It's like they know something's coming. They're preparing for something. Okay, so I went back a week later. They're making more brood, and I have no idea where they're even getting resources from. Luckily, we did have a little bit of a purple loosestrife flow that was coming in. I noticed that there must not have been much of those flowers in the area for that yard in particular, because my other yards were really doing good and capitalizing off that flow. But the bees in that yard, you can only see a little bit of it coming in. And I say it was purple loosestrife because it has like that green like antifreeze hue in the comb, and that's what I was seeing. But luckily that was enough, and them knowing that goldenrod was coming, they started amping up their brood production. It took me a couple more weeks before we could finally get our hands on syrup, so that's also why I wasn't feeding them right away. There was a lot of moving parts of trying to get all this stuff to come together. That's what it is when you're still in the building process of everything. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because when goldenrod hit the end of August and through September, And that's when you were checking your hives. Of course, your hives are going to be looking good because they had been planning and growing their numbers in preparation for that goldenrod flow. Because really what I'm starting to notice is the bees really start preparing more so for pollen than they do for nectar. And I've been putting together a beekeeping course, spoiler alert, and one of the recent things I've learned is that bees have evolved from, first they were wasps like 100 million years ago. They found them in like tree amber, and that's the only reason why they're saying we know this stuff. But they found that the bees, they originally ate, they were predators of other insects that were in their area, and that's how they were able to feed their brood. Well, at some point, they began realizing that they could go to flowers and collect pollen, and that's what they would use to store throughout the winter and to feed all of the brood that they had in their hive. Well, I mentioned this because I wonder if honeybees still really prioritize a protein source, pollen, more so than nectar and honey. Now, they're both equally as important, but the reason I'm saying this is I don't think we give pollen enough importance to why the bees do what they do and how they do all of their timing throughout the year and prepare for the winter. I think pollen is probably one of the most important parts to overwintering, and just knowing what we've kind of talked about today about Vitellogenin and it's how it's related to pollen and how Vitellogenin is what Varroa mites feed off of, I'm really kind of starting to wonder if maybe that is part of the missing puzzle piece that we need to get hives throughout the winter successfully, even if there's Varroa in the hive. Because that was another thing with these hives I'm telling you about in the hunting yard. At first, I thought it was Varroa mites, so I checked the mite count in that yard, and I was only seeing about a 1% infestation amongst all of the hives, and I was making sure I was checking it off of frames that were from newly emerged brood, so that it was the most accurate reading I could possibly get. But anyways, so for those who have lost their hives, what did your hive look like in August? That's one question. When did you feed it all this year? When did you pull honey? Did you pull honey? Did you have them drawing out supers or any frames whatsoever anytime past mid-July? If you did, they used a lot of resources to do that. One of the other things I've learned this year is the importance of letting your hive just completely condense down the colony with as much nectar and honey as possible. And I think one of the things too is that so many new beekeepers are terrified of their bees swarming, because that's pretty much what you always hear is don't let them swarm in the spring, don't let them swarm in the fall. So we start giving them all these extra boxes when in reality they need the most minimal amount of space as possible, so they can start condensing it down and shrinking their brood nest and coating every part of that hive, all the frames, in as much honey as possible. Okay, so I feel like I am really rambling at this point, but I'm just trying to make sure my point is kind of like coming out clearly through my words so that you can understand kind of like the connections I'm making in my brain. I don't know if any of this is maybe right. Some of this is just like a theory of maybe pollen can affect Varroa mites, just judging off of the research that has been done. So the question I have for you is, do you think that feeding pollen as a way of preparing for winter may be essential for the colony's winter health and could be a way of helping the bees overcome Varroa? This is definitely something I'm going to be experimenting with in the future. We kind of did this year because we fed all of our colonies right when goldenrod hit, and that's what I was hoping to do, so they could grow really well with that extra sugar off of the pollen as well to prepare for winter properly. But yeah, I don't know. I want to hear what you guys think. But all right, I'll stop rambling. We do have nukes for sale. I just posted them. If you want to put in a pre-order for 2025 spring spring nukes, definitely put that in before they're all gone because they will go quickly. Last year was such a huge success and we had so much fun meeting every single person that came out. I think that was probably my favorite memory from the whole year, just because seeing all of you who follow the channel and who want to buy bees from us and are a part of this community, of the BeeFit community that we are building, it just really means the world to me. You have absolutely no idea. So yeah, if you want some nukes, go down in the description. I'll put a link, and that is that. I hope you guys have a great day, and don't quit and be fit.